All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. Apologies for the technical difficulty that we are working our way through, but thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books welcomes Missouri debut novelist Gordy Sauer, who will discuss his highly anticipated debut, an accomplished literary Western set partially in St. Louis, Child in the Valley. And tonight, Sauer will be in conversation with UMSL MFA alum Michael Nye. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Gordy and Michael, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. Our doors are also now open to the public, so you can come in and find this incredible book on our front table. We are very happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for any of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, towards the end of the hour. So please type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. Our fall calendar is packed with incredible events for readers of all ages. And now about tonight's book, Child in the Valley. 17-year-old Joshua Gaines is an orphaned foster son of a failed doctor on the run from his father's debt. In 1849, he travels to Independence, Missouri, and falls in with the mysterious four-fingered Renard and his companion, formerly enslaved Free Ray. Joshua offers his medical expertise to their family, and together they embark on the 1,500-mile overland journey to Gold Rush, California. Following the hardships, disease, and death on the trail, the company abandons panning the river in favor of robbery and murder. Engulfed by violence, the young doctor-turned-marauder must reckon with his own morality, his growing desire for the men around him, and the brutality that has haunted him all his life. For fans of The Revenant and Ian McGuire's The North Water, Child in the Valley is a gorgeously rendered tale cut from the turmoil of a fledgling America. Gordy Sauer's careful eye and penetrating literary lens offers a modern, incisive look into the complexities of masculinity, isolation, and the impenetrable nature of greed. Larry McMurtry, the author of Lonesome Dove, says, Child in the Valley is vividly brutal and haunting, well beyond its subject matter. Gordy Sauer has a bright future ahead of him. And James A. McLaughlin, the Edgar Award-winning author of Bearskin, says, Gordy Sauer is a serious talent, an assured voice reminiscent of Ian McGuire. Early in Child in the Valley, there is some temptation to stop the marvel at the language, the vivid imagery, but the characters are real and the story compels, insists upon headlong reading. Unflinching and piercing, pungent with surprising details, Sauer's prose transports to a fully realized 19th century frontier milieu, a violent, energetic, uncomfortable place and time. About our speakers this evening. Gordy Sauer is a native Texan and transplant Missourian. He holds an MFA from Columbia University and an MA from Clemson University. His writing has appeared in Narrative Magazine and Boulevard, among other places, and he received a 2013 Artists Grant for residency at the Vermont Studio Center. A lifelong educator, he has taught snowboarding, fly fishing, and now works as a speechwriter at Mizzou. He lives in Columbia, Missouri. Tonight, Gordy will be in conversation with Michael Nye. Michael is the author of 3 books of fiction, most recently the story collection Until We Have Faces. His writing has appeared in Boulevard, Epic, Kenyon Review, LitHub, and The Millions, among many, many others. He is the editor of Story. And now, without further ado, I am so happy and proud to welcome our guest for the evening, Gordy Sauer and Michael Nye. If you could please help me in giving them a giant round of applause.
Great to be here. Thank you, Shane. Yeah.
I'm just glad that I made it. I know our audience doesn't know, but I've been trying to get to this video for a solid 30 minutes right now. So my big writing tip for everybody is to make sure you don't have a 5-year-old laptop.
Yeah. But we made it. We're here, right? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I've got, it's cool. You can see all my wife's office stuff behind me because we're currently sharing an office because of the pandemic. And so I have a nice, neat desk, but my wife has all the cool accoutrements behind us. So you're really getting a look at what my wife's work is like as opposed to mine. But, that's okay. We're not here for me. We're here about your book, which is, I'm thrilled to get the chance to revisit it. I read early drafts of this. You and I have talked about this book for years. And now it's finally here. And just congratulations. I mean, it's a tremendous accomplishment. It's a fantastic book. I reread it this weekend. I'm really happy for you. I'm just delighted that it's in the world.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm stoked, that we can do this event in St. Louis of all places. I know we both have that really strong Missouri connection, and it's great to be able to come to Left Bank, even if we're coming virtually, and to have this conversation with an old friend and, new friends on the line. So yeah, it's great to be here. And thanks to Left Bank, and thanks to everyone for being here.
Yeah, it'd be great to actually be there in person. When I used to live in St. Louis, there was a great restaurant right across the street called Duff's. And River Styx, the journal based in St. Louis, used to host a Monday night reading series there once a month. And so I have very fond memories of seeing people walking by the plate glass window as we were trying to do our events. And then we'd have some rough Tuesday mornings. But I have a strong affection for St. Louis and always will.
Yeah. It's a good city.
It's not too bad. Yeah. So this book, you've been working on it for a very long time. You and I have been talking about it for years. Looking back from the very beginning, what was the genesis for this book idea? Because I know it's the first one that you've published, but not necessarily the first one that you wrote.
Yeah. I think that a lot of writers kind of have stories like that, that there are those books in the drawers or on the, hard drives that are there. And maybe they've seen kind of some light either in like excerpt kind of publications, or maybe they've seen light in terms of like being shopped around, but not having been picked up. But for the most part, they exist more as artifacts toward that debut product, which, is debut in the literal sense, but also is like not really a debut because you kind of debut, once you write that first book. So, for me, the book actually goes back to about 2014. And at that time, I'd been writing another novel and had finished it and didn't really kind of think that it was a very good project, had not really found much success with it. And so I was sitting down and kind of trying to think about what the next project could be. And there were a lot of things sort of kind of happening in 2014. I'd been doing some kind of residencies. I'd been in Vermont like the previous summer. I was teaching here in Missouri. I'd only been in Missouri a couple of years. But that also meant that I was learning a lot about Missouri history and kind of the seminal role that Missouri played and continues to play in American history. And I was going back and forth to Kansas City because I had aunts out there. My father grew up in Kansas City, and so I still have some family out there. And I'd gone into Kansas City, and I was staying at one of my aunt's house actually, and watching the History Channel really late at night. And this story came on about a doctor from Boston named Dr. Charles Robinson, who in 1849 packed up and moved to Independence so that he could join a gold rush train to go out to California to, get rich. And he was very impoverished. And so he didn't have what at that time was the substantial seed money to join a gold rush train. Because the way that it worked was that people had to actually pay about $300 a person to sign up with these caravans that were heading out west. And, the caravan guaranteed safety and security. It guaranteed food. It also guaranteed, a directional route that got you from point A to point B, which in 1849 is a pretty big deal because, not many people knew how to actually get out to the gold field successfully. So because he didn't have that money, he offered his medical services in exchange for free passage. And it was that story that actually served as kind of the impetus for what would it be like to have a doctor on the California Trail, because that had never occurred to me before. Medicine wasn't something I think that I even associated with the gold rush. I mean, the gold rush always seemed just so kind of nitty gritty and chaotic. And the idea that you could have these physicians out there, even though those physicians were different in 1849 than we kind of think about physicians today, was just a really kind of striking idea to me. It seemed to bring a lot of kind of things in the mix from the mid-19th century, the ideas of burgeoning science, because obviously, you also had a lot of burgeoning religion. It introduced like another dynamic component to the gold rush that I had never thought about. So it was that story that kind of planted that seed for Joshua. And Joshua's not at all based on Charles Robinson, but that is where I actually got the idea about having a doctor on the California Trail. And then, thinking outside of that, the other things that were happening then, just in terms of kind of like politics and what was happening with society, I was really interested in this idea of the rise and fall of the American Union. I mean, I know I talked about this in one of the pieces that I wrote, but you had a lot of conflict in the West between ranchers and like the National Park Service, right? You had a lot of these kind of radical fringe movements that seemed to be moving into a kind of mainstream rhetorical space, or at least mainstream visibility, with the rise in social media and stuff. And that, pervasive idea of freedom seemed to really permeate all of these conversations we were having. And so it was something that I was really interested in. And that rise and fall of the American Union, coupled with this idea of a doctor on the trail, and how those things would come together in 1849 to form the backbone of what could be a strong narrative in a moment that really defined, I think, our country's direction and geography, just sparked the novel. And I went from there and started writing.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because along with the politics of freedom, one of the things that I found in Josh's story that still resonates today is greed. When thinking about Joshua, because you've got this baseline for how you're inventing him as a character, how did you develop that sense of greed as the book goes forward? Because it takes him a long time to get to California before he and the other members of the party can actually start attempting to become wealthy.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I always knew that I wanted to build an anti-hero character. And that, honestly, sometimes I approach writing from a challenge perspective, and it's this idea of if I can get the reader to kind of think certain things or feel certain ways and sort of introduce challenges in my own writing that then present challenges to the reader, I can be kind of successful on the page. And a big challenge for me was how to create a character that readers would be sympathetic to in the beginning of the novel. And then by virtue of that character's own choices throughout the novel, you would lose your sympathies for him, but not so entirely that you would lose all sympathy for him, right? So that kind of challenge of, can we read characters who do bad things without ever fully turning on that character as a reader? And there are a lot of, I think, stories that kind of do that, right? I mean, and there are a lot of TV shows that do that. I mean, I know, last night we were chatting about kind of some of them, but that central premise to me really drove a lot of what I was trying to do in creating the book. And I think that greed is one of those, we can call it whatever we want, but a kind of anti-virtue that is often something born from circumstances outside of one's own decision-making, right? Or by circumstances that are more chance-filled than not. We're not, I think there are a lot of ways in which poverty and kind of impoverishment happen beyond an individual's own choices and own hard work and decision making. And the desire for more, right, and the desire for a better life is a very human desire. I think particularly a very American desire in a kind of culture and a community that is driven a lot by how we see ourselves in terms of that barometer of the American dream. So greed to me was an interesting anti-virtue in the sense that I could understand why someone would really want to better their life, even if the process they chose to better their life was shifting them into a negative direction. And so I really tried to kind of think through Joshua's desires, right? You know, what is it that is really motivating his want for money? And I don't always think that it's a bad thing in the book. I think that it turns into a bad thing by virtue of the fact that he becomes overwhelmed by that desire. He's not able to moderate that desire, even if he achieves some successes along the way. And I think that, again, that's a very human challenge, right? That we can find success and then, you know, the appetite for more just grows. And sometimes that gets beyond our control. So for me, it was a process of trying to kind of put Joshua into situations in the book where he would get these markers of success that he had thought that he wanted, and then he would shift the goalpost, right? He would move that marker forward because he wanted to have a little bit more and a little bit more. And then, you know, it snowballs and turns into full-blown greed.
Yeah, it's what you said about poverty is really interesting because you have that great opening chapter, which, well, you know, you've made some adjustments from what I first read when you were drafting this novel, but that really incredible opening chapter where both his parents die on the Mississippi, taken in, he's an orphan. It's a visceral, really heart-wrenching opening chapter. And then the next thing we see in chapter 2 is that Joshua is pretending to be a doctor, though he has training, he's intelligent, and he's desperate to go moving forward and be a part of this gold rush. So you've set up this really terrific sense of, you know, like you were saying with an anti-hero, elements that you're really sympathetic to. A character that, you know, hopefully we don't identify with. I mean, that's a horrible way to start your life.
Yeah.
A lot of sympathy there. And for the reader, you really get a sense that what he's lacking is love.
Yeah.
He thinks that he can solve that problem with money. I mean, I don't know if you get a more American story than that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. You know, I think that it's interesting because when I wrote the first draft of this book, I wrote probably 30,000 words between that first chapter and that second chapter. And then those 30,000 words just became backstory, right? That drove my understanding of Joshua so that I could jump from chapter 1, the prelude, to, you know, chapter 1. And I think a lot of writers go through that process, right? You're like writing into a character and figuring them out. And then you don't actually need to tell that story that you wrote of their backstory, but that is fodder for you to then kind of leech off of as you siphon in, you know, the circumstances of them getting there. And, you know, this idea, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that he is driven by a want for love. I think he's also driven in a lot of ways by the desire to belong, you know, that he has felt like he hasn't belonged in all of the kind of spaces and among all of the communities that he's sort of been involved with. And I think that really guides a lot of what he does and a lot of the, you know, poor decisions that he makes along the trail and, you know, with the group that he joins up with Renard and Free Ray and the twins and the Englishman G. Quillard, you know, that he really wants to belong. And for him, ultimately, what kind of happens is that he sees wealth as the path to belonging. And I do think that is a narrative that is kind of like tried and tested in America. And it's one that I think the gold rush perpetuated, right? I mean, that was the idea that people could go out there and get rich and you belonged into this other sort of echelon of society.
Yeah. And it was interesting as I was reading this book and thinking about the aspects that I remember about Joshua that, you know, are part of his backstory that drive this narrative that you don't reveal to the reader because you're trying to get the story going forward. Was there a particular part of his backstory that was really difficult for you to cut from the book that you really didn't want to let go of, but you had to for the sake of the novel's pacing and plot?
Yeah, I mean, I think his early years, right? I think when he was, because I did actually write quite a few pages. I don't know how many exactly, maybe 30 or 40, but of him at like age 5, and then at age 10, and then at age 14, right? And those years where I think, like, for me, I was very empathetic to him and saw him as a very impressionable young man in a very formative time, right? And the real tenderness, I think, that he had and shared with his adopted father, Dr. Gaines, that really kind of was a part of those early pages. And you see some of that in some of the flashback. I mean, you see some of that tenderness, but then you also see it in a little bit of a jaded way, because he's more of a teenager at that point, right? And there's a scene where they're walking along and he's sharing this kind of moment with his father, and someone in front of him drops a silver dollar, right? And he it was actually a gold dollar at that point, but he bends down to pick it up and to pocket it, or he finds it on the ground. He doesn't see someone drop it, and he bends down to pick it up and pocket it. And Dr. Gaines insists that they ask the people in front of them, who are evidently wealthy by the way that they're dressed, this is in St. Louis, if it's their gold dollar. And the guy that they ask about it, of course, lies and says, oh yeah, my wife dropped that. And Joshua tries to kind of hedge and say he didn't see that happen, but Dr. Gaines refuses to kind of believe him, and instead says, we have to trust what people say. And I think that there are those really tender moments between him and his father that are subverted by his father's principles, and the principles that Joshua is often kind of like butting up against. And there were a lot more of those scenes, I think, that I had in those pages that I cut. And they were difficult to cut because they really engendered for me a lot of compassion for Joshua, which I didn't subsequently lose, but I also didn't then put down into the book, right? It's more an implied kind of tenderness. So those are those difficult choices. But I do think that by virtue of the pace and, the way that the book ended up, I think it's stronger because I cut them. But that's also because I had to write them to be able to cut them.
Yeah, and the real gut-wrenching scene is when he gets beat up in a flashback. Yeah. When he's a teenager. That was just, and it's not just that you feel terrible for this young Joshua, for this boy. It's such a viscerally written scene. I mean, it's brutal. The way he's beaten and assaulted, and it also sets up the violence that's to come. And, I don't know exactly what page it's on, but it feels like the transition is coming.
Yeah.
That sense of where the violence that rises up in Joshua in the second half of this book, where the roots of that are. It's not just a sense of poverty and a lack of love. There's a lot of self-hatred, anger at the world that comes out of the scene. I mean, that scene's that's a stunner.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, I know. I mean, it was a tough scene to write. But it felt very essential. And you're right, it does come at a moment, they're on the trail and there's kind of a flashback, and it was a turning point for him in his life. And also because of the way his father reacts when he gets home, right? I mean, his father is very compassionate, and very comforting, but he says a line about, women not biting an unrefined man kind of thing. I mean, he says a very biting line to Joshua that suggests to Joshua that he brought it on himself a little bit. And that I think kills Joshua more than the actual events that happened, because he feels like he's essentially in some ways stabbed in the back by his father, right? That he's been assaulted by these boys who are his age. He knows that he's been ostracized kind of in the community. He knows that his like friendships kind of aren't a thing that exists for him. And so when he turns to the one man who he's always leaned on, who then kind of turns on him a little bit, it's a really biting moment for him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, without question.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit more fun about the writing process. I got a kick out of the names of this party, right? We've got this great, stalwart biblical name like Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
Renard, where you feel like you're, using a last name. He seems kind of mysterious. And then you have G. Quillard, just as a name.
Yeah.
And Free Ray, and then Clayton and Clayton. Mm-hmm. A little bit of comic relief at times from them, but just the way that you put this group of men together, it's kind of an odd thing to say as a reader, but I felt like you were having a good time creating these characters and putting that party together.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, for sure. I was having a good time. I mean, you're right that does, and by, because of who they become, that sounds like a weird thing to say. But I think that I was very aware of trying to kind of capture a lot of different personalities, but a lot of big personalities in this group. And, there is, I think, like each of them, I think, have their own sort of personalities. It's interesting that Free Ray is the only one who kind of has a history out of those 6 individuals, including Joshua. The others exist more just in the immediacy of the moment. And then, Renard is just mysterious, I think. I mean, he's kind of the most enigmatic character. As far as the names, though, a lot of times I think names just sort of pop into my head. And I think as the characters just kind of like pop into the book. And I know that feels kind of like a cop-out as like an answer. But, there is that level of trusting the kind of creative intuition, whatever it is that allows you to kind of write the book. And I remember that I was writing this scene when Joshua was in Mechner's, and he was sort of like milling around in that store in Independence, and I didn't really know what was going to happen next. And then all of a sudden in my head, this long-haired, red-haired man with 8 fingers walks into the store. And I was like, oh, this is what's going to happen. Like, you have this like man come in who's kind of enigmatic and really alluring to Joshua because of that mysteriousness. And that's where the book is going to shift. And actually his name Renard just sort of like popped into my head. Same thing with Free Ray, who's standing outside the store. And then the Claytons, I just like the idea of identical twins who also had the same name. It felt kind of like they would have lazy parents, right? And so that was kind of funny to me. And then, one of them is spelled with a K, Clayton, and one of them is spelled with a C. But of course, they can't write because it's the mid-19th century and a lot of people couldn't write. So they didn't actually know that their names are spelled differently. And there's that moment where they're in Wyoming and Joshua's trying to etch their names in Independence Rock, which was actually a thing that the 49ers did. Like, you can go to Independence Rock in Wyoming and see all these names and all these dates. And he spells the name Clayton the same way, because he didn't know that they were spelled differently. So, there are those little moments that I think are just fun to do as a writer, and to think in that kind of 360-degree way, right? Find those little details that really pop and make that moment feel alive. Yeah.
Yeah, Renard and his red hair is a good reminder. You can never trust a man with red hair.
Yeah, says the man with red hair.
I know of what I speak.
Yeah.
So you brought up Free Ray.
Yeah.
This is a book that is also touching on race. Free Ray is in Independence, Missouri in 1849. The traveling party comes across a wide range of immigrants that are working in the American West. One of the times that the party raids, robs, and kills everyone is because they know that they can blame the immigrants for what's happening. They intentionally scalp their victims so that people believe that it's Native Americans committing these crimes rather than these guys. How did you approach race as a topic, both as a contemporary and, let's just say it, as a white male writer, but trying to stay true to the historical fiction of the era your book is set in?
Yeah, that is a really good and I think important question. And, there's always a way, I think, when you write historical fiction that you have to be mindful of a kind of contemporary moralizing, right? I mean, particularly if you're trying to write historical realism. I mean, I know there are different aspects of historical fiction where I think sometimes that contemporary moralizing can come in, but there's also never a way that you can write historical fiction from a now perspective without having the now kind of infuse on the then, right? I mean, and you shouldn't, because I think that to just write it exactly as it was is to also negate the fact that historical fiction is meant to speak to our time as much as it speaks to the time in which it's set, right? And that the narrative has to do kind of both jobs and share that kind of relationship. So for me, race in the mid-19th century, just as it exists today, is a vital topic, right? When we think about kind of America, and when we think about the history of America and the narrative of America and the myth of kind of like American expansion and sort of opportunity, all of that is embroiled in how we think about and how we talk about kind of race and the role that race and ethnicity and diversity and inclusion, or in the mid-19th century, a lack of inclusion, play, and all of that. So I really wanted to try to think through how the characters would perceive themselves in that moment, and to have them operating as if they would operate in the mid-19th century. But I also did not want to and try to not let that overwhelm our own kind of critique of the mid-19th century America and critique of kind of America today and the way that we think about these critical issues. So, it was a very deliberate process. Like all of the choices that I made, from how Free Ray's story was revealed to the kind of general reticence that he has in the book, right? Were very intentional choices, and I wanted to give him his own agency and autonomy, and tried really hard to give him the most kind of agency and autonomy in that group of six. Again, he's the only character out of that group who has an actual history, and that is also because I see him as critical to Joshua's growth. Like, once we get past kind of that period of descent, it's really Free Ray who, facilitates a lot of that like self-reflection in Joshua, and partly because he is totally kind of discompassionate to the choices that Joshua's made. I mean, there is an opportunity for Free Ray at the kind of very end of the book. I won't divulge what happened, but to kind of quote unquote help Joshua and sort of like save him, and he chooses not to, right? And I think like that's not his burden to save Joshua, and in a way I think that was me trying to kind of iterate that the narrative of characters of color in Westerns is one that is a fabricated narrative, and if we think about it on a more kind of like microscopic and intentional level, then it helps us kind of rethink our own American history and the way that the Western genre in particular and the myth of American expansion has been a narrative of exclusion for far too long.
Yeah, and the other contemporary question that you're really addressing with this book is sexuality. Mm-hmm. And Josh's sexuality it's something that the other characters seem a little bit more aware of than Joshua is. Mm-hmm. And it really comes to fruition at the end of the book when he makes it to California. Why was that such an important element of his character for you to develop? I mean, you've hit it all in this book, right? You're touching on race, you're touching on class and sexuality as well. What makes that so intricate to who Joshua is that it must be a part of his story?
I mean, for me, I think so much of it was thinking about, so much of this book, right, was thinking about what the Western genre has been versus what the Western genre could be in the 21st century. And thinking about how the Western genre can be opened up to show characters and show identities and like reveal voices and perspectives that are historically excluded from the Western genre. But it's also, it was critical that these characters existed in that kind of genre space, right? Because I think that writing against the Western outside of the Western allows the Western to just kind of perpetuate that, narrative of exclusion. But instead, bringing these characters into a Western, but also, bringing them in discompassionately, shows kind of the ways in which I think the Western can be broken down. I mean, that was kind of one of the things I was trying to do. I often talk about the book as an anti-Western, but it also helps push the genre into a direction of investigation, right? And into a kind of direction of critique. And that, for me, was really important. In Joshua's sexuality, I think that his experiences in St. Louis and stuff have led him to really kind of shield that part of himself, because he doesn't feel like that, again, that belonging happens outside of that, right? So he tries to put on this, just air of being someone other than he is. Whether I think the characters actively see through that, the other characters, or whether they just think that they see through that, to me was less important than Joshua's own kind of ability to realize that belonging had to happen through his own kind of self-realization and self-investigation. And that's, I think, where we get to the end of the book. And like in San Francisco, when he's going through this process again of like self-discovery and embracing kind of who he is in different ways, and then responding to kind of the acts that he's done and the way that he sees himself in that moment.
So an anti-Western with an anti-hero.
Yeah.
That's
a lot of anti.
Yeah, that's a lot of against. If you're thinking about this book going towards something, what is it going toward? What is it after, as opposed to being, against something?
Well, I think being against can go toward, right? I mean, I guess I don't know that writing against something is writing away from something. I mean, I think that particularly when you use genre elements, right? If you're writing kind of using the genre, but writing against the genre, you're working toward like a kind of reclamation of the genre, right? And a reimagining of the genre. It's moving into, I think, like new territory, right? I mean, when you kind of do that kind of stuff. So there's always that element of creation. And for me, that, is something that I think a lot of really great books do. I mean, there are a lot of books that use genre elements and then work against genre elements that I think are moving toward these sort of new and expansive territories because they're working against that.
So we have a question from one of our viewers. Marcia Clark asks, did your gathering necessary historical knowledge of the times precede your writing?
Mm-hmm.
You conduct your research as your writing dictated, more info was needed?
I suppose a little of both. I see that, and she's right. Marcia, you're right. Like a little of both. Yeah. It's interesting. I did probably the most intense research that I had to do was on the California Trail to really get that section where it was, because I wanted to get that section accurate. And then I had to do a lot of research on the Gold Rush too, but those are pretty complementary, because I think once I nailed a lot of that research on the California Trail, that filtered into the Gold Rush. So Marcia is right. I did do a lot of preliminary research, but I also did feel like some of that preliminary research was slowing down the writing process. So I did do trail research actually while I was writing the trail sections. And then I also did trail research after I'd written the trail section and went back and heavily revised based on that supplemental research. And really one of the best things I did for that research was that I actually drove the entirety of the California Trail from Independence, Missouri to Coloma, California, where Sutter's Mill is located, so that I could really feel like what that process of moving across half of the country looked like, and how meandering, right, the trail was. I mean, right now we have I-70 that goes kind of like all the way out there, but it's a very meandering route up through Nebraska and Wyoming, and then up and down from Idaho into kind of Utah, Nevada, and then California. And so I really wanted to feel that and experience that. And I had to do that actually after I wrote the first draft of the novel, because I had to have the character's progression in my head before I could nail down some of that geographical progression more succinctly.
It also must have been nice to not have to travel on I-70 through Kansas, which is one of the worst stretches of the interstate highway system, isn't it? Just the most boring and mundane drive you can possibly do.
Yeah, and it does make you think, like, why didn't they go that way? But then, of course, they run headlong into the Rockies in Colorado. So it makes sense why they didn't go that way. Yeah.
Yeah, the mountains do get a little bit in the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about how this book was important for you to set a challenge for yourself at the very beginning. I know that writers can be superstitious about this, but you and I have talked a little bit about the next book. What is the next challenge that you want to set up for yourself when it comes to writing a second novel?
I think it's to do something different. I think that I would like to work within another genre. I feel like I wrote my Western, and maybe I'll return to that genre again at some point in the future. It's a genre that, growing up in Texas, I really, it was very potent to my childhood. So it's one that I still really admire, albeit is very fraught and has a lot of problems as a genre. But I think for me, it's like moving into another genre, whether that's kind of science fiction or whether it's a more just like fundamentally literary space. And then also moving into kind of a contemporary realm. I think that is a challenge that I spend so much time in the kind of historical headspace that sometimes it is difficult for me to think as a writer in a contemporary headspace, just because I lived for 7 years in this, mid-19th century, and, found so many things about the research and the process of writing through this time period that I liked. So the next challenge would be to kind of jump out of that and do something that feels very different, even if it deals in some ways with some similar themes, like the creation myth of America. I mean, I think that's a theme that I'll write a lot about for a long time. Yeah. Why
does that particular theme grasp you? Why is that one that you want to keep chipping away at?
Because I just think that it's so layered. I think that it's one that we're always interrogating. I think it's one that we continue to revise every year that goes by. I also think it's one that is always evolving. I mean, right, the creation myth of America always stays one step ahead of our ability to catch up to it, just because it's so potent, right? I mean, I don't think you can ever fully catch a myth. And so, but it's because it's always moving, there's also another way to tackle it and another way to think about it. So it's something I think that I could continue to do in a lot of different ways, and then do very differently and learn a lot about myself as a writer and just as a thinker out of. Yeah.
Have you thought about what the challenge a contemporary novel would create for you? Like you said, you've been in this historical space for 7 years. Do you kind of think, are you already kind of framing what you think that contemporary challenge is going to present for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the challenges, of course, is how to think about a contemporary book in a COVID and post-COVID world, right? I mean, that almost for the last 100 years, you could write a book that was set in a contemporary moment, and people would sort of understand the constraints of that world and understand the possibilities of that world, regardless of whether you time-stamped it. And now, I think the way that movement happens, I mean, the way that social interactions happen, travel, right, communication, all of that has been upended in a COVID environment. And so if you set a book now in a pre-COVID environment, it is suddenly time-stamped in a way that it never has been before, right? 2019 is a totally different world than 2020. So I think that's a challenge with contemporary literature now, is that you're either having to work through COVID or post-COVID, or pre-COVID, how we do that as writers, I think is just going to be challenging.
Yeah, without question.
Hi.
Welcome back.
This has been an incredible conversation. And actually, something about what you just said. One of our previous authors that we hosted started writing her book when the book was contemporary. It took her like 17 years for the publication process, and it became historical fiction. So hopefully that doesn't happen to anything that is written contemporarily right now. But I want to remind the audience watching that if you have any questions, you can type those up in the comments section, either in Facebook or in YouTube, and we have plenty of time for those now. But I wanted to ask you, a lot of the things that I wanted to ask you have already been talked about. So, like, were you raised with Westerns, and was that part of the rebellion? But I think one of the questions that hasn't been asked is, in your research process, was there anything that you found that was particularly interesting that you were either unable to work into the narrative or that completely changed where you were going with the narrative?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, the biggest thing I think I actually learned in terms of research, particularly the gold rush research, was how much the landscape was manipulated during the gold rush. I think that I had never thought about that, early on, before I even wrote the third part of the book, the kind of gold rush part of the book. I'd gone out and camped and taken gold panning lessons at the Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park. And I remember that I was sort of following along in one of these tours. I for some reason, am very kind of like sometimes anti-park tours, but I was kind of like shadowing in the background. And one of the park rangers said that all of the trees, all these redwoods that surrounded the park and that were kind of along the bank didn't exist in 1849 because they'd all been cut down to build the structures and to burn into charcoal so that people would have charcoal. And that idea that the landscape could be so dramatically different just because of how it had been manipulated had never occurred to me before, right? I mean, I think oftentimes we think about a landscape as changing, but we think about it changing very slowly. And we also think about more remote regions as being relatively stagnant sometimes, unless they get burned by wildfire or something like that. And so this idea that, the landscape was fundamentally different in 1849 than I was experiencing it in 2016 had made me have to rethink how I would have them engage with the land apart from how I could engage with the land, right? And so then when I went back and drove on the trail all the way out there, I was constantly sort of interrogating, what am I seeing? What would they have been seeing? And then how would that impact them seeing it this way, right? So, because I think we can always sort of think about what people experience, but it's that reaction to characters that I think makes the characters alive. And so that for me was kind of the big aha moment in terms of the research. Yeah.
We established before the event started that we are roughly the same age, and you spent a lot of time in Kansas City as a child, and I grew up near Kansas City. So I'm wondering what, from your childhood, especially since Oregon Trail was so popular when we were kids, but also and I don't remember any of the details except that it's somewhere in Kansas City, there is a museum that does like kind of the start of the Oregon Trail type museum. And I learned how to build barrels and do like some iron smithing and things like that. So I'm wondering if there were any things like that from your childhood that really like propelled you towards this subject.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the link between Kansas City and then, by default, Missouri and Texas, because you had the big cattle trail, right, that ran up kind of from Abilene up to Kansas City. You also had this really weird connection with Missouri during the Civil War in Texas, where the exiled Confederate government went down to Northeast Texas and actually established Missouri's Confederate kind of government in Northeast Texas in, exile, and then supposedly ruled the Confederate Missouri from Texas, even though Missouri had instilled like a Union governor at that time. So you had these really fascinating connections between Texas and Missouri that I became aware of kind of growing up and visiting Kansas City. And then, learning more about that connection sort of pushed me into learning more about Missouri's kind of pivotal role as a sort of linchpin to so much of what happened in American history throughout the 19th century, right? I mean, in so many ways, whether that was the jumping off point for all these trails, whether it was, the birth of aviation, right? Whether it was the cattle industry, the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, right? So I think all of these things I just gained from visiting Kansas City and thinking about Kansas City as a real kind of spark for so many things in the country. Yeah.
Michael, did you grow up in Missouri?
I did not. I'm from Ohio originally, which is where I'm living now. I spent 6 years in St. Louis and then 6 in Columbia. And it's funny, when Gordy said, I started writing the book in 2014, I keep thinking of dates from the 21st century as being not that long ago until I do the math. And then I'm like, oh, that's a really long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then it's just like, wow, 7 years. It's a long time to be working on one book.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but, and hopefully not too long, right? I mean, I guess in like an author's life, sometimes I feel like year 7, year 10, but you're right. I mean, and there's always that process of kind of production and then creation and then, post-production, right? It's all kind of like in there, but yeah, I mean, it was a heavy lift, but I'm totally thrilled with the finished product. Hub City did an incredible job. Yeah.
And I want to remind everyone that they can order a copy of this book. Apparently, we are having a little bit of issues with the link on the website, but you can give the store a call during regular business hours, or you can even leave a message and say, put one of these on hold for me.
Yeah.
And we will, but you can call the store at 314-367-6731. Michael, your book, which I shared the link for, is available and is live on our website. So we do have your newest collection on our shelves now, which congratulations.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
I'm a little biased.
Yeah.
But, I know the author. He's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any final questions, Michael? Because we have just maybe a little bit more time.
Yeah, I do. So, Gordy, you've become a new father.
Yeah.
So have I. I know it's brand new for both of us, but can you talk just a little bit about how you're trying to manage writing and family? I think that's a question we often ask women authors, but we don't ask male authors enough. And that's just something that I thought would be interesting to share with the audience.
I think trying is the key word. Managing is not happening right now. It is something that I think that is talked about in a very gendered way. Parenthood in sort of writing. And that's also, I think, the societal burden that's placed on mothers in terms of, parenthood and stuff. So I think really for me, the most difficult thing is being present in both. I mean, it takes so much energy to be present in writing. And then of course, a child takes just a sort of insurmountable amount of energy. And I think that's something that I'm still trying to figure out. I mean, she's, 3 months old at this point. And so I don't know that it's actually been enough time for me to figure out how to navigate both of these realms. But I think that it is interesting that now being a father, I actually think about Joshua differently and his relationship with his adopted father and then, his kind of lost biological parents. And so that's been kind of a revelation, right? That it has evolved the way that I think about the book. And I wouldn't do anything different in the book, but it does make me I think sometimes react in a different way because I probably wrote it from the child's perspective, right? The son's perspective, and then am now reading it from the father's perspective. So there's always that, self-discovery in that. But trying to manage, I think, is a good way to put it. Hopefully I'll figure out a more productive way to write and be a father. Right now, most of the energy is funneled into fatherhood. Yeah.
You just got to embrace changing diapers, man.
That's right.
It's just a fun game. You tell your daughter you're so excited that she pooped. You're like, yes, good job. Yeah, it's got to treat it like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Today's my niece's her second birthday, so
yeah.
I'm not dealing with that right now, but my sister sure is.
Yeah. It's it feels like a long way to 2. So yeah, now that we're just in 3 months right now, so it's a long way to 2, but yeah.
My daughter just had her 6-month birthday.
Yeah.
So my family did a little cupcake with a candle. And so we're singing to her, we're applauding, and she has no idea what's going on, right? She's just like, what? And so we tried to get her to like touch the cupcake, and she just kept staring at the candle. So we clearly had a lot more fun than she did, but at least she was paying attention, and we will take that.
Yeah.
It's been fun to share that, right, Michael? I mean, we've had that shared experience of being fathers and being writers, and actually, on a very similar calendar. So I can kind of follow your lead because you're 3 months ahead of me. So yeah, where can I be in 3 months? I can be where you are now. Yeah.
You can learn from the mistakes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's been great. Yeah, I mean, you and I talk all the time. You know how much I love it, and it is interesting though what you said about how it makes you think about Joshua as a character. It's such a different perspective. I don't have anything unique or interesting to say about parenthood, but it really is quite a shift in the way you think about yourself as an author and then your characters as well. And I just think that's really fascinating what you said.
Well, I want to thank you both for this really brilliant conversation. It's really been a pleasure. It's been a while since I've seen you, Michael, so it's really good to see you. And a reminder that Child in the Valley is available at Left Bank Books, so you can call and get yourself a copy on reserve now, or you can come into the store and find it on our front table on display. And I want to thank the audience for coming out tonight, for watching this event, and we hope to see you again really soon.
Thank you again to Left Bank and Michael. Always a pleasure. Yeah.
Let's do it again when you're writing the book. Yeah. Yeah, it was great.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate it. Yeah.
Without question. Great to see you both. I love doing something for Gordy and for Left Bank and the St. Louis community. Appreciate all the questions and everybody tuning in. Thank you so much.
Yeah.